All right, welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to talk about Athens, Sparta, kind of use those two cities as a lens through which to view Greek political and social life, and then we'll talk about the eventual clash between those cities and their allies in the Peloponnesian War. So to start off with, talking about political structures in ancient Greece, there's really three broad categories that we can use, and then other things might kind of fall into these categories, but you can have rule by an individual, rule by all of the citizenry, or rule by a smaller group of the citizenry. So top left, we can have the idea of either a monarch or a tyrant. A monarch would be an individual who has, in ancient Greece, pretty much unchecked power, and it's someone who inherits their position of authority from their father. A tyrant we can think of more like a dictator. A lot of times this would be someone who takes their authority, or they take their power by force or threat of force. Sometimes, however, it would just be someone who is able to rise to power because of popular demand, but they are vested by their people with pretty much unlimited power. So that would be a tyrant, or in today's terms, we might call that person a dictator. If you look on the top right, we have the political system that the Greeks are most famous for, and that would be democracy. Demos being the idea of the will of the people. And so in a democracy, you would have an equal share of authority vested in all of the citizens of a given polis, a given city. That doesn't mean all of the individuals. Even in America today, if you're a 14-year-old, you might be a full-fledged citizen with the ability to own property and full legal protections under the law, the right to a trial. But that doesn't mean that you're able to vote or hold office. There are going to be age restrictions on that. And depending on the polis that you're in, your citizenship is almost certainly going to be determined by birth. Your father would have had to have been a citizen, and your mother would have had to have been someone who was born into the city-state, not a citizen, because in most of these cases, the women were not considered full citizens. And then there might be other things that you'd have to accomplish or achieve in order to be considered a full citizen. But regardless, a democracy would be a rule by all of the people where authority is shared. Decisions are made equally by all of the citizens of a given city-state. And then down here at the bottom, you have what you can call this by several different names. I prefer oligarchy. Oligarchy just means rule by a few people, like a smaller group of people. Oftentimes, this winds up being an aristocracy or a plutocracy. Aristocracy means a rule by, the people who consider themselves the best. Maybe it's by the most noble birth or whatever it is, but they consider themselves the best citizens. Plutocracy just means the wealthiest of the citizens. The people who consider themselves the best, the aristocrats, usually also wind up being the rich, and they also usually wind up being the few who control the levers of power. There's this concept in political thought called the iron law of oligarchy. And what it means is that regardless of what kind of system you say you live in an oligarchy. So let's say that you live in a monarchy or a dictatorship. That individual is not going to be able to wield their power effectively unless they keep a small elite group of people happy. A lot of times these are the people who have the control over the military or over certain really important economic sectors. And it's the same thing with a democracy. Everyone might say that they have an equal vote in how the society is going to be run, but they're going to be led and they're going to be ultimately influenced by a smaller group of people who have more wealth, more influence, more power, whether that be military power or economic power. So these are the three systems, and they can slide pretty easily one into the other. A mob of people exercising democracy might, under certain times of conflict, place all of their authority into an individual, a tyrant, a great man, they might call it, right? And that democracy could turn into a tyranny pretty quickly, or a democracy might vest their power into a small group of citizens that they feel are more equipped, or that group of citizens might have power wrested from them by the mob or by a tyrant. So it's not like these city-states always had the exact same type of rulers in charge of the city. However, it was, these are the basic three categories that you can divide political structures in. I would say even until today, you have, monarchy, or let's maybe even say autocracy, ruled by one self, right? So that would be a monarch or a tyrant, a dictator. You have democracy, and then you have oligarchy, ruled by a few people, typically the wealthy, typically the people who consider themselves the best, the elites, the aristocrats. So like I said, we're going to take two cities, and we're going to use Athens and Sparta as kind of windows into the political life and the political structures of ancient Greece, and then we'll see how they clash with each other. So if you think of ancient Athens, let's be honest, if you're thinking of ancient Greece, you're almost certainly thinking of ancient Athens. Ancient Athens is the cultural and real spiritual center of Greece. When you think of Athens, you think of a lot of individual people or accomplishments or things that came out of it. You think of the patron goddess, Athena. You think this is where Plato wrote his Republic on how a political system needs to be organized. This is where Pericles, sometimes considered to be the greatest statesman of ancient history, ruled. This is where Herodotus wrote his histories. It's not where he's from. He's called Herodotus of Halicarnassus, which is from Ionia, over on the Anatolian Peninsula, but it didn't matter. You had to get to Athens. Athens is where you went in order to make things happen. This is where Socrates and Aristotle and other philosophers famously philosophized. This is where the Parthenon, which is the Agora temple to Athena, was built. This is where Sophocles wrote his plays, including Oedipus Rex. So a lot of the most famous accomplishments when it came to culture or politics or philosophy, they're all centered around the city of Athens. One might say that, apart from maybe Rome, maybe Jerusalem, Athens is the city of the ancient world that has had the most influence on Western civilization. If we were to look at their political structure, you can say you have the rulers, you have the full citizens, you have the lower second-class citizens, maybe we'd just call them lower-class individuals, and then you'd have the slaves. So in the city of Athens, which is located here in the city-state of Attica, it's kind of like the capital of Attica, you had rule by a group of people called the council, and then the citizens, the first-class citizens, were this group of people. It was determined by your bloodline. It was, obviously you couldn't be a citizen unless your father was a citizen. So it was determined by your blood, and then those citizens were themselves divided into four different strata, four different levels, right? These are the people who could vote, could hold office, could own land. They were the full citizens of ancient Athens. So the people at the top of that pyramid, the hyper elite, they could run for the highest office in the land, which was called the archon. Arch just means like the chief, so you can think of this person as like the elected leader of the entire city of Athens, and having a position of prominence and a little bit more power than the regular council members. Underneath that, you would have the mounted aristocracy, people who could own horses. Underneath that would be the hoplites, so foot soldiers, heavy infantry, elite heavy infantry of ancient Greece, ancient Athens. And then below that you would have craftsmen. So this would be like a potter or a tanner, leatherwork or something like that. These are the people. All of these people, however, would have been citizens, but your access to certain levers of power would have been determined by which of these four strata you were born into. And then you have the lower class. These are people who are not slaves, but they're definitely not able to access all of the privileges of citizenship. So they can't own property, they can't attend the assembly in order to make their voice heard and in order to vote. They can't run for office, they can't do any of those things. And women, especially in ancient Athens, were considered second-class citizens. They didn't have access to any, even if they were born of citizen parents or a citizen father, they still didn't have access to any of those levers of power that the male full citizens did. Not even eligible to be in the, let's say, the fourth rung or the fourth level of citizenship. One of the reasons that Athens was so influential was because of its agora. The agora of Athens is the most notable in all of ancient Greece. Remember, the agora is like the marketplace. This is where you would go to sell your fish or to sell your grain or jewelry or whatever it is. This is kind of like the shopping epicenter of the polis, of the city. And so because of that, this is where different people would come to talk about philosophy or talk about politics. So we have different philosophers. We have Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. These are called the Hellenic philosophers, and then a couple of what's called Hellenistic philosophers. In Zeno, he was one of the first Stoic or most notable Stoic philosophers, and then Epicurus, who has a philosophy named after him. So these philosophies were discussed at length in the Agora, and then you have all of these famous statesmen who come out of ancient Athens. You have Solon and Draco and Pisistratus, Cleisthenes, and then most notably Pericles. So we'll zoom in on just a few of these statesmen for today. We won't talk about the philosophers. I'm going to save those for a later lesson. But a few of them would have been up here at the top. You have the archons, Draco and Solon. Draco is kind of where we get the word draconic from. He was elected as the archon, the chief of the city, the leader of the city, and draconic is a word that we would use to refer to laws that are especially harsh and don't really give any mercy or grace. Under Draco, there were a lot of infractions, a lot of crimes that were just punished by death, even seemingly small crimes. So he's remembered pretty disfavorably, let's say, pretty negatively in the history of Athens, even by the Athenians. But then a little bit later than him, you have this guy over here, Solon, on the top right, and he is considered one of the greatest of the early archons elected to that position. And he's also considered one of the 7 sages. Very magnanimous leader, very kind, very wise. He organizes for the forgiving of a lot of debts. He gives more individuals more access to more of the levers of power. And then one of the, I think, interesting things that he does is he sets up this legal framework where if you were a father, you were expected to teach your son a trade. You had to teach him some kind of skill for him to be able to succeed economically. And if you did that, if you had trained your son in a trade, then when you became old, it was expected that he would provide for you through that trade. So we have this idea where you're thinking not just about, today, not just about the next couple of years, but you're thinking decades and lifetimes into the future, where you get this cycle of men who are taking some time away from other pursuits that they could be doing in order to make sure that their sons understand how to facilitate some kind of trade, some kind of productive work that they could do in order to provide for themselves, their family, and their elder parents in their parents' old age. The greatest of the Athenian statesmen, most people would say, and I would agree, is this guy here on the bottom. However, he is not an archon. He's not elected to position. He's a tyrant. He gains his power really by amassing the popular support of the people, but not through a vote. He's never elected as the archon. At least that's not how he initially rises to power. So Pericles, he is known for extending democracy to its fullest extent. In Athens, giving even more people, even more access to even more of the levers of power and positions of power. He also is the one who makes it where in Athens, holding political office is now a paid position. Before that, if you wanted to hold the position of archon or be on the council, you had to have enough funds saved up for the year that you were going to serve, or however long your term was, that you could afford to just not work. Now, maybe that means that you're a plutocrat, you're really wealthy, and you have your slaves that are managing your estate, so you can just kind of leave. But because under Pericles, because of the fact that under him political office becomes a paid position, that means that you're now able to serve in those roles even if you're not an ultra wealthy person who can afford to just not work for a year. He also amasses enough wealth that they're able to start work on the Parthenon, which is honestly, it's right up there with the pyramids or the Colosseum as one of the most noteworthy and one of the most well-known monuments of any ancient culture in the world, in all of world history. And then another important thing that he does that this will become important later on is he's the one who really enlarges and empowers this league of allies that becomes known as the Delian League. After the Greco-Persian Wars, remember the question is asked, okay, there's kind of unresolved business. The Persians have been pushed off of this western chunk of Greece, the mainland, But the Ionians, the men of Ephesus and Miletus, they are still living under Persian control. And are the Greeks going to band together to push the Persians not only out of mainland Greece, but also out of western Anatolia? And the Athenians are the ones who say, yes, we must do this. And it's Pericles who organizes all of these islands, all of these kind of coastal areas, and he builds up a massive navy, most powerful navy in the world at that point. And his goal ultimately is to free the Ionians from Persian domination. Now, there are some other things that come as a result of the formation of the Delian League that we'll see here a little bit later on, but that is his goal, and it's one of the most notable things that he does over the course of his time as the tyrant of Athens. So let's switch gears and now talk about Sparta. If you're thinking about ancient Athens, like I said, you could be thinking about a lot of things. You could be thinking of poetry, literature, architecture, philosophy, politics. But if you're thinking of ancient Sparta, you're really only thinking of one thing, and that is their military. They are known for having the elite Spartan hoplites, the elite phalanx formation that was considered far superior, even above other Greek phalanxes or other Greek hoplites. And that's because that is what they focused on. They did not focus on creating great philosophers or great historians. They focused on creating great warriors. In fact, because of that, a lot of the things that we know about Sparta were not written by Spartans. They're written by Athenians. So sometimes you have to take some of the information with a grain of salt, since they were enemies at different points in their history. But let's talk about their social structure, and then we'll talk more about their military. So the Spartans had a social structure that was a little bit different than Athens. They had a dual monarchy, so they had two royal families that both exercised power, and they were kind of like unelected archons. There were things that they could and couldn't do. They had certain religious obligations and other things that, they were not considered absolute rulers who could just do absolutely whatever they wanted. But these are the rulers of Sparta would have been those dual monarchs, and then underneath that you have the full-fledged citizens, what are called the Spartiatoi, or the Spartiates. And the Spartiates became Spartiates not just by your blood, so you had to have full citizen blood. Both your mother and your father had to be citizens, and so we can see in this case that women were eligible for certain levels of citizenship. But it wasn't just that. If you wanted to be a citizen of ancient Sparta, then you had to have undergone 13 years of military training that began when you were 7 years old, a process called the agoge. The agoge, which you would finish when you're 20 years old. If you were to fulfill that entire training regimen for 13 years, then you became eligible for citizenship. But the other thing that you had to do is you had to pay. You had to be able to afford to pay to upkeep your armor, upkeep your membership in the full citizen league, the group of people who were able to vote and hold office in Sparta. But even people who are not Spartiates, lower class citizens who are called the Periokoi, or also the women of Sparta, they were considered citizens of a different level. They couldn't vote in the assembly. They couldn't attend the assembly or vote in the matters of the assembly. They couldn't hold office, but they were able to own land. So this is a big deal. The Spartan women were among the most privileged women in all of the ancient world. They could own land, they could inherit land, they could manage estates in the absence of their husbands. They were very well respected. In fact, just like the men were expected to be physically fit, they were also considered, it was expected that they would be physically fit so that they could bear fit children and keep Sparta strong that way. So they did have a slave class, and just like the Athenians, just like pretty much every ancient civilization had a slave class. We'll talk about them more in a little bit, but let's talk about that training regimen. If you were going to become a full Spartiate, a Spartan hoplite, then at birth you were handed over to the elders of the city, and they would inspect you, and if there was any kind of deformity or anything weak or sickly looking about you, then they would leave you at the bottom of a hill to be devoured by animals, and they had no patience or no grace given for any signs of weakness. And so kind of harsh, we would think, and it's not just that we would think it's harsh, I think that's pretty objectively harsh. But then when you were 7 years old, you would begin the process of the agoge, the training regimen, where you would learn to fight in the phalanx formation, or even just fight individually with the spear and the shield and the short sword that they had. These boys were trained rigorously, not just in armed combat, but in unarmed combat. Extreme endurance sports and activities were part of their daily regimen. One of the most important things that they were supposed to be instilled with was the ability to ignore pain. And because of this, they were beaten regularly, not just for punishment, but weekly. They would have beatings where they would just subject you to beatings and expect you not to show any signs of pain. There's a story famously told by an Athenian, which I think in this case might make it more plausible, but there was a Spartan boy who was in the Agoge program, and he had stolen a wolf cub, and he was confronted about stealing the cub, and he denied it, and he was hiding the cub under his toga, and while he was hiding the cub, the cub started to chew at his skin and at his stomach, and chewed his way kind of through the boy's skin, and eventually the boy started bleeding so profusely that he died. But he was supposed to have not shown any signs of pain when he was being interrogated. So whether that's true or not, that might be kind of a legend. However, it is a story that comes out of it, and these boys were considered very capable of demonstrating high pain tolerance. They were also not starved, but they were fed subsistence rations. They were pretty much only given this porridge, this gruel type of food, and they were given it in very small numbers. And if you could steal some meat, or if you could steal some vegetables to be able to add to it, then you could supplement your own food. But part of their rationality behind this is they believed at the time that if you kept boys thin, that they would grow to be tall. And that's not exactly true, but this is not the only thing that they got wrong. And so you were expected to steal to supplement your rations. But if you were caught stealing, then you were beat even more heavily. And you were not beaten for stealing; you were beaten for being inefficient enough or being a bad enough thief that you allowed yourself to be caught. And so, because of this, the boys grew to be very tough. Very, very stern with themselves, a word that we'll learn a little bit more about later, stoic, and to have high pain tolerance and high levels of self-discipline that made them the elite fighting formation in all of ancient Greece. Lastly, with Sparta, let's talk a little bit about their slave population. So they were not unique in owning slaves, but they were unique in the treatment and the number of slaves that they owned. The slaves that were owned by the Spartans were called the Helots, and it is suspected that they may have outnumbered the free Spartan population 9-1. So 90% of the people living in Laconia, which is the city-state that Sparta is kind of the capital of, kind of like Athens is the capital of Attica, Sparta is the capital of Laconia. They would have been 90% Helot slaves. These were conquered peoples, people who had been brought to Sparta, having been conquered from either other Greek city-states or even just other places around the world. Sometimes, depends on exactly how they got their hands on them, but they were used to plow the fields, because if you were a Spartan citizen, if you were a full Spartan citizen, not a perioikoi, but a Spartiate, then you were not allowed to have a job other than warrior. You were not a potter, you were not a tanner, you were not a farmer or a fisherman, you were a warrior. And so the Helots were expected to do the agricultural work, and the perioikoi could do the craftsman type of work. But these slaves were treated incredibly brutally. They were beaten mercilessly. They were sent out to the front of battles, and that was because, so you'd have these people, kind of like this guy at the bottom left, he's called a pellist. They were not given any armor, not given a shield, but just a few javelins thrown out into the front of a battle before the Spartan phalanx would move in, and they were just expected to throw a few javelins, maybe soften up the enemy formations a little bit, and then get steamrolled. And then also, I've said this before to some of my students, I think if I was to pick a specific life that is the worst life a human being could ever live, I would pick an ancient galley slave. A galley slave would be one of the oarsmen who were tasked with rowing these trireme boats that you see here at the bottom right. If you were conquered and made to live as a galley slave, you were chained to your bench, you were chained to your oars, and you were never let loose for anything. There would be men who would go down the aisles and kind of feed you with this long ladle, that porridge, gruel type of subsistence food that they would feed you on. If you needed to urinate or defecate, then you just did so right where you sat. You were never unchained, not to sleep, not to eat, not to go to the bathroom. You stayed there chained forever, and the smell would have been absolutely abominable. And it said that only whenever there was a heavy rainstorm was the smell and the filth washed away. There might have been times where the smell became unbearable for the soldiers who were at the top of the ship, and so they sent men down with large buckets to kind of just pour over these men. But there was no escape, and you either died at your oar from an infection or from malnourishment or just from being beaten to death, or when the ship sank, you sank with it. You were not unchained from your oar or from your bench. You just sank with it. And so you might think, well, if they outnumber the Spartans 90-10 or 90%, 9-1, then why didn't they rise up? And there's a few reasons that are given for this. One is that they were beaten so mercilessly. One is that every year, at the beginning of the year, the Spartans declared war on their own Helot slave population. And so you could kill a Helot slave with virtually no consequences, other than the fact that, you damaged someone's property. And then another thing is that after, at night, whenever they would kind of send them to their slaves' quarters, they gave them unlimited alcohol. And because of that, instead of spending those nights plotting of how can we overthrow our slave masters, they would just get drunk. And so they kept them drugged enough that they weren't able to really formulate any plan for overthrowing the Spartans. So Athens and Sparta, very different from each other, and eventually these differences come to a head in what's called the Peloponnesian War. I've already mentioned that with Pericles in charge, the Athenians had a league or an alliance that's called the Delian League. The Spartans also had a league called the Peloponnesian League. So Sparta is located on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, kind of the southernmost part of mainland Greece, and they had themselves also an alliance with the Corinthians, with the Macedonians. Macedonians were also considered pretty hardcore. As a boy, you were expected to wear a sash around your waist until you had killed your first man in battle. I'll talk more about the Macedonians in the next lesson. But the Spartans begin to get nervous about the fact that the Athenian Delian League is growing and growing and growing. And they're also starting to be kind of cruel with their the members of their alliance. So they expect a monthly fee, a monthly supply of ships and soldiers. And the Spartans go, well, if you're treating your allies like this, how are you any better than the Persians? Other than the fact that you're, ethnically Greek and you speak Greek, the Persians, they would have charged them a monthly tribute and expected them to contribute soldiers and ships just like you are. And the Peloponnesian War begins to be fought between them. And although Athens has the upper hand early on in the war because they have a more advanced navy and obviously more spread out island territories, a couple things happen to really bring the Athenians down. One is the fact that when the Spartans march up to the city of Athens, the Athenians lock themselves in, and they think themselves kind of impenetrable. Even hoplites can't puncture through walls, and they have access to supply lines that'll keep them from being starved to death. But they lock themselves in their walls, and then a plague breaks out, and the plague actually kills several of the Athenian soldiers and Athenian leaders, and that helps the Spartans to kind of soften up the Athenians. And then the other thing that happens is that the Persians come to the Spartans with a deal, and they tell the Spartans, hey, I know that you are not really concerned for the Ionian Greeks, and the Athenians really want to help the Ionians to break out of our empire and to revolt against us again. We'll make you a deal. If you take out the Athenians and promise to leave Ionia to us, leave the Ionian Greeks as one of our possessions, then we will fund a massive fleet, a fleet that's bigger and more powerful than the Athenians. And the Spartans take the deal, right? Because to them, it's like, hey, we don't care about the Ionians anyway. We don't want to be the saviors or the babysitters of all of Greece. And so because of those things and other things, the Peloponnesian War ends in a Spartan victory over the Athenians. The victory, however, is kind of anticlimactic because, like I said, the Spartans don't really care about being the rulers of all of Greece. It's not like now that they've conquered the Athenians, they're going to exercise control over Athenians. The Spartans kind of just want to be left alone so they can, do push-ups and get really good at killing people. And as a result of that, at the end of the Peloponnesian War, Athens has been massively depleted. Her fleet has been massively depleted. And the Peloponnesian League, Sparta and her allies, even though they have the victory, Sparta's not really interested in taking over Greece. However, one of the allies of Sparta is interested in that. So you have Macedonia up here at the top. The north, they were considered as like barely Greeks. A lot of the Greeks thought of them as being like part Greek, part barbarian, just because they were so brutal. They wore animal skins instead of linen togas like the rest of the Greeks. Their dialect of Greek was considered to be kind of sloppy and kind of undignified, not the classical Athenian Greek, or even the Koine Greek, the common Greek that was spoken by most of the other Greek city-states. But the Macedonians, after a while, they have themselves a king whose name is Philip II. And Philip II of Macedon, he winds up enlarging his kingdom of Macedon and even not really conquering, but taking control over Thrace, which would have also been kind of really on the borderline of what you could consider Greeks. And he also unites the rest of Greece, or almost all of the rest of Greece, underneath his leadership in what's called the League of Corinth, the Corinthian League. So Corinth and Thebes and Athens and all these other famous Greek city-states are led by Macedonia. And notably, you'll see this, that the only real Greek city-state on the mainland that is not that does not join this league are the Spartans. The Spartans look up there at Philip of Macedon and they say, hey, if you want to control all of Greece, knock yourself out. You're more than welcome to do that, but we are not really interested in being part of whatever you're doing. So the Spartans are left out of what the Macedonians are about to do. And what Philip II wants to do, but what he dies too early to accomplish, is to get payback against the Persians for the damage that they had done over Greece. So Philip II dies, but his son, Alexander III, Alexander, we'll eventually call him the Great, inherits his empire and his army and uses it to wage war against Persia. So that's what we'll talk about in the next lecture. But for now, that's all I have for you guys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a blessed day.